In case you don't know me, my name's Tom Schumacher. I've been leading this group since probably October of 2015, I think. So I'm going on my, what would that be, 4th year? So with that, what I'd like to do is hand the floor over to our sponsor, Tech Systems, the building that you're in. They've also purchased our dinner. Unfortunately for you, Tim, you have to watch us all eat.
That's okay. You're going to help me.
We'll email you something, or
Postmates maybe.
Yeah, something.
You're boosting my appetite. Look at it that way. So after we're finished, I'll go strap on the food bag.
Okay, so Nick, take it away.
Cool. Yeah, happy to see some new faces. Definitely a lot of familiar faces, of course. Tech Systems, IT services company. So if you guys are looking for a new job, or a friend of yours is looking, just want some resume advice, even just some industry statistics about what someone with your skill set should ask from a salary perspective in negotiations. We'll just want to help you guys out. So this is the way I've been supporting the group, just provide the room, provide some food, and just kind of let you guys go at it. So Tom has all my contact info. If you guys are looking or just want to get some updates or want to pass it off to a friend, you can reach out to him. I'll leave some cards here as well. But other than that, yeah, Happy New Year, everyone. We'll do it again next month, and I'll pass it back over. Get a sandwich and get on out of here.
Sounds good. Okay. So with that, I must confess I don't remember the exact title, but it's about making getting your transition to Visual Studio Code from ISE, right?
That's right.
Okay, Tim, the floor's yours. I guess we could start a couple minutes early. So
okay.
Take her away.
All right, stand by for the screen share. Let me know when you see, I'm colorblind, but I think my desktop background is green.
Yeah. Greenish blue. Yeah, that'll work.
There you go. Well, okay. Thanks, Tom. It's great to be back. Hey, everybody. Glad to be with you all again. And as Tom mentioned, this is all about easing your transition from PowerShell ISE to Visual Studio Code. You might have seen over the last year or so, and this is just my opinion. Everything I say, of course, is just my opinion. But Microsoft has been a little cagey, I think, with their messaging about ISE. At one point, they used deprecated, but then they kind of backed off. But regardless of how you look at it, we're enthusiastically recommended by Microsoft to shift our PowerShell work to using Visual Studio Code as opposed to ISE. And supposedly ISE is under limited or no future development, whereas the ISE is updated almost, you might argue, too much. It seems like every time I open the editor, there's a new build available to install. And like any open source project, you may or may not have been burned. I know I was going to do a presentation like tonight, and literally minutes before it started, I popped open code and PowerShell was all messed up, and I had to use ISE, even though I think I was talking about code, because the build I had, the latest build, had some glitch or bug with the PowerShell extension. So anyway, I'm going to hopefully shorten your learning curve if you need that, and give you tips and tricks, and just to get you hitting the ground running as quickly as possible. Now, right now, I'm only on a single monitor machine, so I don't have the chat window in a separate display. So Tom or any attendee, any questions as we go along, please just interrupt me, stop me in my tracks, and I'll address it.
Okay, so there might be a little bit of a delay, but I'm working with Oliver, since we're using my laptop, to make sure that we get those questions relayed to you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, okay, that sounds good. So I figured the way we'll do this, I thought about a storyline to take us just from front to back here, from installing to configuring to actually using the tool with PowerShell. Code.visualstudio.com is the project homepage, and you can download, as you see here, we can go to other platforms on that page, 32, 64-bit Windows versions, Linux, Mac. So again, the new Microsoft playing well with others. This is open source cross-platform software, so that if you do work in multiple environments, you not only can use the same code editor, but as I'll show you in just a moment, you can actually keep all of your extensions and all of your preferences synchronized across all your workstations. That's super useful.
It also works on Raspberry Pi too.
There you go. Yeah, that's something else to throw in. This project is hosted at github.com in the Microsoft VS Code repository, as you see right here. So that means that the community can contribute extensions, color themes, whatever it is. It's an extensible platform. I know ISE has the ability to develop add-ons, and there's ISE Steroids, which is still a really great tool. But in code, it's fully community-based, and if you're not familiar with GitHub yet, get familiar, especially now that you can have private repos with a free account. That was announced either today or yesterday. But if you go to the releases page, that'll give you direct download links to the current preview versions or current standard version. And if you do run into a bug with the version that you're using, you can always uninstall it, go fetch an earlier release, and install that to work around the problem. Finally, the issue of enterprise deployments. There's a couple ways to programmatically deploy code to your workstation or workstations, or maybe even potentially some of your servers, depending upon how you manage. The XE, I was looking around this morning for an MSI, but it's been a while since I was in System Center. You can use XEs there, right? It's not like group policy where you have to have an MSI package.
Anybody know? Anybody at SSCM? Sorry?
I haven't seen it.
One of the participants says no.
No, okay. All right. So it is an XE and not an MSI installer. But as you see on the page now, if you go to PowerShell Gallery, there's a script that former PowerShell team member David Wilson created called Install VS Code that'll automate installing the software and the PowerShell extension. At the Chocolatey Gallery, if you trust that, Ravi Chiganti, who's a noted member of our community, wrote a package in there. I think his deals with DSC, deploying VS Code via desired state configuration. So again, I just am trying to cover as many broad bases as possible, ways to automate the installation. Very bread and butter, really. When you go through the graphical installer, you can add the tool to your system path, which I think is a good idea. You know, that kind of stuff. All right, so I have the tool installed on this workstation we're on. Now I want to address the issue of running as an administrator. The Microsoft team has tried to make it easier to deploy code by not requiring administrative elevation to install. And when you start the code editor, normally it's going to start with just standard user credentials. As you know, as a PowerShell scripter, in most cases, you'll want to have elevated credentials when you run the tool. Now, that's been a feature that's been requested of the code team for a long time to make it possible to maybe pop up an elevated PowerShell terminal within VS Code. But as of now, it's just the standard rules that apply. For instance, you know how with the ISE or the PowerShell console, you can right-click the icon and then run as administrator. That can be problematic if you run as a standard user, though, like I do, because you're going to shift your user context to a totally different user. And you might have your PowerShell profile scripts all ready to rock under your standard user, and then it's just a pain in the neck. I wanted to make you aware of a project, believe it or not, at sourceforge.net. So it's an old project, but it's called Sudo for Windows. And if you're familiar with the Sudo elevation command in Linux and Mac OS, there's actually a port of Sudo that is an MSI installer, and it works fine under Windows 10. I use it pretty regularly. And what's cool about the Sudo, as you see here, if I right-click my code shortcut, there's a context item that says Sudo, and it allows you to request an elevated administrative token for that session, but it keeps your current user context, so you don't have that context switching and that profile switching. Okay? I hope that all makes some semblance of sense. Okay, once the editor's up, don't mind the stuff you see on the screen. It's likely the text is small. And if you're like me, you're used to using Control with mouse wheel to zoom in and zoom out. So if you're like me, starting with this, you're thinking, well, how can I get that done quickly? It doesn't look like anything obvious. We'll cover that next. The way the editor is laid out, it's multi-file, just like Visual Studio or Sublime Text or ISE for that matter. The term for these tabs is actually editor. So you'll see that in the documentation and then in the tool itself. What was I going to say about that? Something else. Oh, right. Yeah, the fact that the tool, VS Code itself, is you're almost basically using a web browser. Because if you look at how it's constructed, the framework used to develop code is Electron from GitHub, now Microsoft. And Electron uses Google Chromium, the open source Chrome engine for front end, and Node.js in the back end. Isn't that interesting? So it's very much almost a web application / desktop application hybrid. And the code editor in Visual Studio Code comes from what's it called? Visual Studio Team Services, or VSTS, whatever it's called now, Visual Studio Online. That code editor, Monaco, is the code editor used in code. So there's a lot of sharing and cross-pollination going on. Okay, so on the left-hand side of the screen, we'll take a look at each of these in depth. But right now, I want to address an important question of a way to centralize all of your settings and extensions. We haven't done settings or extensions yet, but I want to walk before we run kind of thing. The first extension you should look at, believe it or not, isn't PowerShell, although PowerShell shows up on the left here under recommended, but it's a extension called SettingSync, or SettingSync. Yeah, that's right. So as you saw here, I opened the extensions pane. It goes out to the PowerShell Gallery. Or is it the PS Gallery, or is there a separate gallery for Visual Studio extensions? I think it might be a separate gallery, but it doesn't matter.
It's Visual Studio Code Gallery. There's a gallery out there.
Thank you. So it's a separate repository specifically for VS Code artifacts. This is a really useful extension if you, like me, you have multiple workstations. And it's not exactly tricky to set up, but if you're new to the user interface in VS Code, it can be a little boogery. So it's a good experience for us to click through. So we look up the SettingSync extension, hit the little install button here. And most of the time when you install some kind of extension or theme or whatever, you'll have to reload the editor for the setting to go into effect. So sure enough, we now have a little tiny reload button. And depending upon how much effort the developer put into their extension, there'll be more or less help. So you see in the lower right, we get these little notifications. It's telling us, thanks for installing, and if we need help, we can click out to the extension page. Otherwise, we can get right to it. So at this point, you would set up your initial install of VS Code to be your master. So this is where you would search through the extensions marketplace. And of course, PowerShell extension is the way to unlock PowerShell code editing in VS Code. If we look at the metadata, it's directly from Microsoft. SettingSync is a third-party contributor. The PowerShell extension is directly from the team. I'll go ahead and install it here. And this unlocks a whole lot of functionality in VS Code. It's going to recognize PowerShell file types. It's going to give you the IntelliSense code completion. It's going to give you a very rich debugger. All that comes along for the ride here. So reload again to get that extension. So you're working through, going through the gallery here. Let me use good old Zoom It. See if I can get this working here. The sysinternals tool. And let me show you some tricks here when you're looking for extensions. There's this syntax. I don't know what Microsoft calls it. I just call them @ commands. They're not like @ commands in Twitter, but you notice as soon as you type @ you can get these keywords here. So for instance, if you're new to this, you might just want to look at recommended, or if you're like me, you want to look at the most popular. So you could do a sort by installs or sort by rating to see what most people have downloaded. And you can see that we've got a lot of open source and honest to goodness development here. C, Python. Git Lens, if you know Mike Robbins, he's a big evangelist of that extension. If you use Git source code control, there is Git available directly in VS Code. Git Lens is super nice. I dare say that if you check out Git Lens, you might like it more than Git Kraken or some other tools that have additional licensing costs. It's that good. Notable about Git is that you have to install the Git client in order for VS Code to use Git. It doesn't automatically install it for you. Okay, so as you go through the marketplace, you'll see extensions for just about anything. I mean, you could do a keyword search if you're looking for Markdown. VS Code is pretty darn good about interpreting Markdown, and you can split the display to show the source code on one side and the rendered display on the other. But there's plenty of extensions that community has created for that. Is it called EOF? I need to see non-printing characters. So I found an extension, here it is, Code EOL, that displays new lines and space characters and stuff like that. So I would suggest you just check with colleagues, what do you use, ask around a bit, maybe crowdsource on Twitter, people who are doing what you're doing with PowerShell, and you'll wind up finding a list of extensions that work for you. Once you have an extension installed, you notice that you can call it back up here and either disable it or uninstall it. I always recommend, just like I do with browsers, to regularly audit your extensions and make sure that you're using what you have so you're not putting an undue performance hit on your editor. And of course, there's security. If you don't need it, don't use it. What I have on my to-do list, and I'll challenge you with if you're interested, is to fire up a couple other of the sysinternals tools and see what VS Code is doing. Because given that there's Chromium and Node and web servers popping up, I'd like to use Process Monitor and TCP View at the least to see exactly what code is doing, because I submit there could be some security implications with the fact that it's essentially a desktop browser. But anyway, I digress. Let's go back to that @ mention here. So sort rating. There's a couple other things here I wanted to make sure to cover. Right, so mixed in with the extensions that broaden the functionality of VS Code, there's stuff that at first blush might seem useless, like color themes. I know that I've been a little critical with the Windows 10 issues that we've had this year. It seems like their developers are more concerned with color themes than code stability. But at any rate, it can be helpful, especially if you're colorblind like I am. I can find colorblind-friendly schemes that not only are easier on the eyes, but make the code highlighting worth something, because normally code highlighting for me is utterly worthless. There's themes. You'll also find icons. Again, you might think, well, what in the heck is the good point about icons? Who cares about that? I'll show you that in just a minute. It can make, when you're working with multiple files in Visual Studio Code, a heck of a lot easier. Instead of seeing just generic icons, you're seeing ones that are meaningful to the file types that you're working with. Okay? So that's that. As far as that goes. As far as settings, where do you go to configure your preferences? It all really begins and ends with the command palette. And the default key binding for that, I believe, is Control-Shift-P, but I've used that key binding for screen captures and Snagit for years, so I immediately changed it to Alt-C on my system. You can also get it from the View menu. Looks like my RDP session's a little bit hung up here. Okay. View, command palette. Yeah, let me zoom back in here. Instead of toolbar buttons and getting hung up in the menus, really your navigation can just boil down to using the command palette. And what you'll find here is that a caret goes a long way. In addition to giving you lots of vitamin A, A caret, actually, I misspoke, because that's not a caret, is it? It's a greater than symbol. Depending upon whether you've got the greater than symbol in your command palette, you're either looking at recently used files, recently opened files, or if you add in the greater than symbol, it takes you into command mode. And you see your recently used commands, and then ones that VS Code guesses that you might want to use. So you want to get a key binding that's really fast. I like Alt-C because it's not a big stretch, and C and command palette go in my head. I'll show you how to do the bindings in just a second. But if you just start to type, like settings, we can see right off the bat we've got some stuff down here. There's preferences, open settings, preferences, open settings, JSON, preferences, open settings, UI. Well, what's the difference here? The bottom line, let me scroll out, is that your preferences in VS Code are all stored in JavaScript object notation or JSON files. And you've got on the left side here your default settings, which could be a very big list because it includes not only preferences for the application, but for your extensions as well. And then it's literally as low tech as either copying and pasting them over to the right, or you can click the edit button and it'll bring it over to the right. And this JSON, as you know, is just a comma-separated list of key value pairs. So I'm using the Sublime Material theme dark, and as you can see, even though I imagine the text might be small at this point, it's workbench.color theme, colon, and then the value. There is IntelliSense built into this, so I could add a new setting directly by adding a comma. You can use space here, it doesn't matter. And over here it says on the left, files.autosave off. I could, like I said, click this pen to bring it over, or I could just start to type as you see here, and I can use IntelliSense there. Let me make that not off, but on. And autosave is going to, every 5 minutes or whatever, save your work. It's a good preference to have on, actually. All right? So I'm just doing a cursory overview of extensions and settings to try to set up this settings sync for you. So like I said, you'll be spending time setting up the ideal environment for VS Code on your machine. And then it's time to use the SettingSync extension to upload your settings to GitHub. Because all of your settings and preferences in VS Code are just simple JSON, this person, Sean Khan, had the bright idea, why not use the GitHub gists to store all of your metadata, keep it up there, authenticate using a personal access token, so you can do it programmatically without having to type credentials, and upload your settings, and then on your other machines, just install code, get the SettingSync extension, and now download the settings from your gist. And it's a private gist that's authenticated to a personal access token that you create. It's really an ingenious way to go. And as you see here, it synchronizes your settings, your code snippets, your themes, your icons, your launch configurations for the debugger, key bindings, I mean, everything. It really does grab everything. That's why I'm such a proponent. I ought to contact the developer and say, hey, you know, I evangelize your product a lot, but no, that's not how our community works. How do we use it? Well, we could always look down in the docs and go to his documentation page, but let me show you. Again, command palette to the rescue. We could type upload, and if you see here, it says sync, update, upload settings. So once you install your extensions, you can easily get to them by just opening command palette and typing a keyword. For the SettingSync extension, it would be sync, or I could just type the verb upload. And you notice I also got a match on the PowerShell extension, upload matches bug report to GitHub. If I were to come back here and type PowerShell, I get all of the different things that the PowerShell extension can do, and it can do quite a bit. And you can just keep typing, and let me see, did tab take me down to the selection? I think it did. But the idea is just using the keyboard, you can begin to navigate very quickly. So again, if I go to upload settings and select sync with my mouse or with a keyboard, it does a couple things actually. It pops open your default browser and takes you directly into GitHub, but I don't want to actually show it that way. Instead, you see that in code it's asking us for a GitHub personal access token, so it's best to have that initially. Let me come back to the browser. Assuming that you have a user account at GitHub, I'm not sure. I think you have to have a paid account to do private gists. If you can confirm or deny, I'm just not sure. Things move so quickly. I've had I've had a paid account for a long time, so I don't remember. But
they just changed the rules on that 2 days ago, where so long as you don't have 3 people on your private repo, more than 3, it's completely free, and you can have as many private repos as you want, as long as you don't have more than 3 people on it.
So the number of contributors is the differentiator. And
Right.
I would imagine the private repos also applies to gists.
Can you make a gist private? Because I didn't think you could.
Really?
I don't know.
Oh my gosh. There's nothing sensitive in my preferences or settings files, but
Because I usually share, because when I do a post, I'll post a link to a gist, but
Yeah.
get a script, which means it should be open. I don't know of anybody know if there's a private gist? I've never seen one. I don't know, man. We'll have to look.
Well, I deeply appreciate you bringing that up. That's something that I need to note so I follow up on, because you know what they say about assumptions. Because, I mean, you're authenticating using that personal access token. Let me quickly explain this procedure. When you're logged into GitHub, you'll open your user menu and come down to Settings. It takes you to the Settings page. And then in your Settings page, you come down all the way to the bottom to Developer Settings. And then there we go to Personal Access Token. And we generate a token. Oh, it's asking me to re-authenticate. You want to give it a name like VS Code Settings Sync. I'll call this Dev because I'm not going to use this past the next hour. And for least privilege, you want to bind that token at the smallest level, so it'll just be at the gist level. So maybe what this is doing is the authentication allows VS Code to write to the gist, but as you said, Tom, gists are by their very nature public. So there it is. I guess I learned something new tonight. That's cool.
Well, I think when you create a gist, you can make it seen or not seen, but either way, if you pass a link out, you can see it.
Okay.
Public, is that what it is? Yeah.
Public and secret. And secret, if someone has that link,
They can get to it.
Someone
I
is
see.
they can get to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's not really protected, if you will. It's more of, if you have the link, you got the data.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So it looks like on reflection, the access token is used to give VS Code the privilege to write to the gist and then update it. Because the idea is periodically I re-upload my settings because I might discover a new extension or make a couple new key bindings or a snippet, and I'll want to refresh to send those changes up to the gist, which is effectively the master location. Now it tells us here that it won't display this token again, so you have to make sure to copy it. And then if we come back in here and pop the GitHub personal access token in there, it'll then ask you for the gist URL and you're good to go. Now I'm actually not proceeding with that because I want to pull down the settings that I actually use. So I created a special token for that. So I'm going to download settings. This is what you would do on your second, third, and N installs of VS Code that you want to synchronize with all of the settings that you've uploaded to the gist. You'd install SettingSync, and in the command palette, type download, and then the sync setting asks to download settings. And again, it's going to ask for 2 things. It's going to ask for the personal access token, and it's also going to ask for the gist URL. And you want to note those when you first create them. But if you do forget either one, it's not a big deal. And I'm going to explain why in just a second. Because I actually have that info somewhere here, I think on this page. Yeah. So I've got my token here. Again, I'm not concerned with sharing it because I'm going to delete the token after we finish. So the token, and then it asks for the gist unique ID. And the ID is displayed on the gist's page, on the gist's own page. It's its unique identifier. So once you authenticate now, the output window shows up and it starts to explain what's happening. Again, the text is small at this point because we haven't fixed it, but it looks like it's going to bring down 24 extensions. Wow, that's more than I thought. They're actually not all extensions. I have some themes and icons and so on. And another thing that the output will always give you, remember I mentioned that it could be considered good or bad, is that it'll always echo out the access token and the gist address in its output. So if you do another download tomorrow or something, the first thing it'll do is print out the token in plain text in your output. It's not going to be stored anywhere else, but it seems a little bit unsecure, I guess, for lack of a better term. So this might take a moment or so to pull all that stuff down. Any questions, comments, concerns, or curiosities thus far?
Now, it looks like somebody in the chat session put in a link for the different kinds of gists that there are.
Good. Good. Thank you for that. Yep, that's good stuff. Your preferences are located in the file system. I have the paths up here on the top depending upon your platform. In Windows, it's going to be app data code user. And then as you edit those files, VS Code will create the settings file. So it really makes your settings eminently portable. It's feasible that you could copy the contents of this folder, robocopy it or whatever, to another workstation on your network into the same path to make your settings portable. I think that that was clearly a priority of the development team, to make the code editor as agile and as flexible as possible. If we go over here on the left, we can type @installed to see what's been pulled down. And you can see I've got quite a bit going on here. Let me see if there's anything that pops into head. Well, yeah, about the icons is kind of interesting. Another thing that might not be obvious when you first are working with code is that it's really intended to be worked with folders. You know how in Visual Studio itself you work in the context of a solution? Similar kind of idea here. So we can do file, open folder, or even something called a workspace. So let me go to open folder, and on my desktop I have a folder called icon sample, and it contains a whole bunch of different files using different file types. And let me zoom in here. Remember I mentioned that one benefit of installing an icon pack is that it can simply make visual identification of different file types easier. And I'm not sure which one we're using right now. We'll verify it in just a second. But that's pretty cool. That goes beyond just cosmetics, I submit, and can make your development work more efficient, just because you can have better identification. And then as far as the multi-editor workspace, when you right-click any of these, you can open them to the side. You can open the file directly in the terminal. Never forget about the right-click menu. You can add new assets to your project folder by using these controls up here. So it's very much Visual Studio-esque, like a solution explorer. You can toggle these left panes in a number of different ways. Just left-clicking them multiple times is one way to do it. Notice it says Open Editors. Again, editor is simply a document or a page tab, and then the contents of the folder below. Now, this magnifying glass is a global search and replace, and it's different from Control F. If you're doing Control F or Control H for find or replace respectively, those are going to be mapped only to the current file or current editor that you're focused on. This magnifying glass is cool because in the context of your folder, your work folder, you can do a global search and replace. So I don't think I put a particular string like hello world in any of these. So look, it looks like it is catching more than one instance. That's pretty cool. It can make it easy to do global multi-file search and replace operations. How many of you are fans of good old regular expressions? You can do just a traditional case-insensitive match, case match whole word. Wait a minute. The first one is to match case. The second one is to match whole word. And the third one is to do a regular expression. So it's nice to have that flexibility as well. Let's see here. Okay. Let me do open folder. I have another folder called Project X that has some honest to goodness files in it.
Hey, Tim,
what was the icon pack you loaded?
Yeah, let me go back to that for you. Is this what you were talking about?
Yeah.
Was there an extension for that?
Sample.
Okay, right. Thank you for following up. Yeah. By default, it used to be that Visual Studio didn't have any icons. It was literally generic. But then by default, it started shipping with basic icons. I think I like the Visual VS Code icons. If you go to extensions and you type for extensions, sort installs, you can see by far the most popular icon packs are VS Code icons and material icons. And if you hit down in the lower left corner the gear icon, it gives you one-click access. If you're not quite there yet with the command palette, notice that there's file icon theme. And when you click that, it brings you to the appropriate place in the command palette. It lists themes and any that are associated with icons. So I wonder if it does a live preview.
Hey, we have another question. We have a question online as well, which is, can we automate the complete installation of VS Code and extensions on systems, possibly via command line interface? I think Tom Towns asked that.
Yeah, good question. Where I would recommend you start with that is what I showed earlier, the install VS Code script. At the PowerShell Gallery, there's a script called install VS Code, and that's already done for you. That you just download that script file and then edit it. I haven't tried that. That's something worth investigating tomorrow. What the script will do is fully automate the installation of VS Code and the PowerShell extension. So the way my mind thinks, and I imagine yours does too, just like it says in the next sentence, you may also specify additional extensions by using the appropriate parameter. And then there's even a launch when done parameter that causes VS Code to be launched when you're finished. So that, I think, ought to give you a good head start on programmatically deploying not only code, but also the extensions and other artifacts that you need.
And then there were a couple other posts, one about Choco install VS Code, and the other one about GitHub articles about, I can't see exactly what Francisco was trying to tell us. But anyway, go ahead, Tim. We'll come back to him a little bit.
Yeah, Choco, I imagine you're pulling from chocolatey.org, and I did search for VS Code there. Now, the thing about Chocolatey is that I don't know if I want to call it the Wild West, but I'm not sure how vetted the content is. I have a feeling, well, it does say that the Visual Studio Code package was marked as a trusted package on January 8th. What's today? That's today. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, Choco install VS Code would be another idea. I guess I would just give the general advice of buyer beware, I guess, even though it's free. In other words, do due diligence. Who developed this? How much trust am I willing to put in it? And it looks like with 250,000 downloads, and last update being today, this looks like a good candidate for automated install.
Well, Francisco says, scroll down a little bit.
Okay.
Said, Taco install PS1. It's in there somewhere, so just go ahead and continue, Tim. That way we don't bird dog your whole.
Oh yeah, No, I'm here for all of you, and I'm here to answer your questions. So just feed them right to me. Here we go. So it looks like you've got chocolatey install.ps1 and then tools helpers. Interesting. So I guess that would be an equally cool way to potentially automate, rolling out VS Code with everything you need. Good stuff. I'm picking up some good to-do items myself tonight. Well, let's drill now into PowerShell specifically, shall we? And how do we set it up? We know that we need the extension. So in the extension marketplace, let me bring up PowerShell. We have the extension installed on this system, lickety-split. How about its configuration? What can we do? Well, there's a couple different ways that we can go about this. Why don't we start by in the command palette going to Settings. And again, you want to watch what you're choosing here. We have SettingSync, so we've got that. I don't want to download settings. A few minutes ago, I brought you to Preferences, Open Settings, JSON. Now, that was the original and only way to do settings, a manual process, and you still might like it. As I said, the IntelliSense and everything works. But more recently now, there's a graphical editor that's supposed to be easier to navigate. And I think it is. Because, for instance, you can do a global search across all available settings, like terminal-specific stuff. We haven't even opened the terminal yet, for that matter. But where do you want it to show up by default? I can't imagine running it on the right side of the editor, but you can. Whether you want an integrated terminal that's right in the editor or external, but you might be thinking, for instance, well, how do I boost the font size? I'm 48 years old. My eyes are already starting to go on me. So terminal font. You can immediately start parsing through the hundreds and hundreds of settings that are available. And now these are not default settings because, remember, I did a download from my gist. So it's already customized to my eyes. I set it to Consolis 18 normal weight. So the idea here is that you can, again, a little bit of web searching can give you some useful settings to go for. There's a docs article called VS Code PowerShell Development. There's a nice docs article called Using Visual Studio Code for PowerShell Development, and there's some helpful settings in there that you might want to take a look at. I'll show you my settings in the JSON view and just to share with you what I find helpful. So this is the GUI editor, like I mentioned. And what might be helpful is for us to go under extensions. And then this list could be long depending upon how many extensions you have installed. We'll want to go to PowerShell configuration so we could take a look at PowerShell related options here and think in your mind analog to the tools options available in the PowerShell ISE. I submit this is greater in terms of what you can do. Code formatting options, white space after separator. I mean, it gets pretty in the weeds initially. As far as initial stuff, whether or not you want profiles to load, that's an interesting point. That could be another whole session, actually. If you use PowerShell profiles, it's important to know that the integrated terminal in VS Code is a PowerShell host. That console runs as its own separate host. So, for instance, if you're familiar, why don't I just do a file, new file, and I'm using Control Zoom because I changed that setting, and I'll do a profile, and then I'll do a select star. And then I'll highlight this line and I'll run that selection. It should open the terminal here. Let me open a new terminal. As you see, there's a terminal menu that allows you to toggle on and off the integrated terminal. And this introduces a whole bunch of other subjects for that matter. Hello? Okay, there we go. Alt-R, I believe, is to run the selection. Whoops. Thought I had that bound to Alt-R. It gives us an opportunity to check the selection. But anyway, what I'm getting around to is that you know that there's multiple profiles and there's current user, current host. So you'll want to think of that in terms of whether or not you want your profile to run in this integrated terminal. Because if you've got, for instance, the profile all users, all hosts, or any of the all hosts, those settings are going to be picked up whenever you start a terminal here in VS Code. Okay, now I'd mentioned the scroll wheel. Let me type scroll. Editor, scroll, smooth scrolling. So again, it's just a question of finding the setting that you want. It took me a little bit of research initially to stumble across what settings were called what. You know, the GUI editor is nice, but sometimes it's nice to just get to the heart of the matter. So I'm going to, again, open the command palette and go back to the settings JSON.
I don't know, I just couldn't tell what was going on because it was like monotone kind of.
All right. And on the right-hand side, we see my user settings. And again, these are just key value pairs. Here it is, editor.mousewheelZoom true. And as long as you have that setting in here, you're able to smooth.
Hey, Tim, hold on a second.
Okay.
Hey, Tim, hold on just a second. Can you mute them, Oliver, please? Christopher, whoever that is. Thank you.
Okay. And you know, if you've done work with variables, properties, and methods in PowerShell or the .NET framework or any object-oriented language, you've got the dot separator. Same idea here. You're working through contexts. There's a workbench context that controls your color theme and your icons. When you start up, do you want VS Code to open an empty file for you? And if so, what do you want its title to be? I think, yeah, it looks like if you want to comment out a line, it uses the C# // to comment out a setting. Like I said, the editor.mousewheelZoom is useful, rendering white space to look at non-printing characters. It's, you know, honestly, not too bad, especially if you get a list. I mean, if you like this list, I'm more than happy to make it publicly available on Twitter or whatever. Whoops, looks like my RDP restarted here. Some other settings that are super important that are associated with the PowerShell extension are where your PowerShell engines are. So you've got terminal.integrated.shell.windows, and this will populate automatically when you install the PowerShell extension. You can change this, for instance, if you know Jeff Hicks. I saw he posted a Twitter message today that his New Year's resolution is to work with PowerShell Core exclusively. You could change your default shell here to PWSH, whatever the path is to the PowerShell Core executable. But as I'll show you in just a minute, in the lower right corner of the editor, down here where my mouse is kind of hanging out, it will show you the code, the language that it's detected. Here it's JSON with comments, of course. When you're working with PowerShell, it's going to say PowerShell. And you can easily change your runtime environment there with just a click of the mouse if you're a dual PowerShell person, PowerShell Standard and PowerShell Core. File associations, you can add custom mappings here. PS1, I don't technically need that, but I have that hard-coded in there to make sure that any PS1 I load up is going to be identified as a PowerShell file. Files.default language, you know, in my Pluralsight work, my instructional design work, I work sometimes with text more than PS1, so I actually defaulted my language to plain text, but you can do just the opposite and have that default to PowerShell. Let me open up a new file and let me save it. I'm gonna.
Do they let you do more than? Do they let you do two different terminals? Last I read, they couldn't. Do you know? Like, can you do PWSH and PowerShell.exe?
Not at the same time, to my knowledge.
File, right? You have to flop the profile out. Okay.
So we see that I've created a file and I've saved it as scriptfile.ps1. The icon lit up, which is, you know, as I mentioned before. If we look in the lower right, we've got two what are called launch configurations. I'll show you those when we look at debugging in just a moment. In the lower right corner, we see that the language mode correctly is PowerShell, but if VS Code makes a mistake or just doesn't recognize this file, maybe you're working with Ruby and you're using an RB file extension, that if you get plain text or something that's not correct, that would be a good indication that you need to install the language support via the extensions gallery, and then from then on it should identify correctly. So again, you've got the code completion just like you would in the ISE, and it pops open the parameter sets and so forth here. So that's pretty garden variety. Tab works exactly the same. The parameters drop down just like you would expect. References to variables and functions, all of that is in here. The code coloration is going to depend upon your color theme that you've installed, as I mentioned before. To come back to the lower right again, if you look next to the language mode button, it shows you the PowerShell session menu, as it's called. And if I click that open, it allows you to start the terminal using a different PowerShell engine. And do any of you use x86? At a conference I spoke at, there was one attendee who had a good use case for using the x86 console, and I don't remember what he said. Anybody? I just asked that out of trivia.
I've only had to use it when you have something that's coded for it.
Okay.
Like if you have to get to a 32-bit registry value or something like that.
Thank you. Yeah, you're a real developer, so you can talk about that stuff. Thank you. That goes above me. Yeah, or not necessarily. But as you see here, that basically the PowerShell extension sees what you have installed, and you always have the x86 engine available. And I have installed the release of PowerShell Core before we started tonight, so that's available here as well. So that's an easy way to switch your engine. What was that term, session mode? We can always bring up the command palette, and if we just type session, it looks like we've got restart current session and show session menu. If we type like I did before, the extension name PowerShell, there's a whole bunch of cool options here actually, including open current file in PowerShell ISE, get help for that command, expand alias, and there's even, this is important here, I want to show you this. Look at here, open examples folder. Let me choose that. When you open a folder or a workspace, it'll normally open up in another instance of VS Code. You can have multiple instances of VS Code running if you're a standard user, but you can only have one instance of running it as an administrator. I think that's a limitation of that Electron framework. And my my RDP session bombed again. It happens on this laptop routinely, unfortunately. Okay, let me go and fetch the proper editor here. Got a bunch of them going. Samples? Yeah, here we go. So anyway, what I did is I opened up the command palette menu and said open the samples folder. And again, this comes to us courtesy of the PowerShell extension. And it has some really cool files with sample code, very nicely documented, that allows you to test out various functionality. You can literally read the comments to get started. For instance, you may be familiar with the PowerShell script analyzer. Those rules are baked in here and available. So we could open the command palette again, PS script analyzer, and you see that there's a PowerShell extension setting called select PS script analyzer rules. Now, you might find that you have to actually cut that down, cut the verbosity of it down. It's not showing it. It's giving me an error down here. A PowerShell extension uses the PS script analyzer setting file, cannot update the rules. Wonder why it's not showing it to me. Let me open up another one. PS script It's just a checklist. Here it is. Yeah. So this would be a small nod in the direction of Tobias Veltner's PowerShell ISE, the ISE steroids, if you're familiar with that. I don't think VS Code is there yet in terms of especially the refactoring. I think the resharper, the code refactoring that you can do with ISE steroids, I've never found anything better than that myself. I'm sure there is something that's better, but this is at least a step in the right direction. But you notice that when you drop this down, you can select or deselect these. So if you're getting errors or squiggle lines in your code that come from PS Script Analyzer, you can quiet them down just by dropping down their setting. Another thing, if I come back to my other editor, man, RDP is just almost on a timer. Anybody have experience with that? The RDP session just locking and dying and immediately reconnecting on a schedule? It happens only on this particular Lenovo laptop that I'm on. Yeah.
Rice in there. Clean out the rice.
Let me go to Debug Test. Debug Test allows you to get a feel for the debugging environment, and I'm pretty clumsy in here, to be perfectly honest. So I'm just going to take you into the debugging view, what you see on the left. You all, especially Tom, could probably go through this all day. But in terms of setting different kinds of breakpoints, they're available, watching variable values, looking at the call stack history. That, from what I've been told, it's a pretty rich and robust debugger from, you know, this certainly isn't a full-fledged IDE like Visual Studio itself is. It's called a code editor, a multi-language code editor. But I think that the debugger is pretty functional. Tom, can you speak to the PowerShell debugging in VS Code?
For the most part, it's pretty good. I have problems from time to time when I'm trying to debug a PowerShell module that it's kind of clunky. Mm-hmm. And I still haven't got all the launch settings down properly. Mm-hmm. I haven't gone through them all.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That was really cool what you did show, that you could switch from PWSH to PowerShell, which I thought was pretty cool. I didn't know that was there.
Yeah, as you see here, the configurations allow you to customize different environments for debugging your code against, including the ability to do PWSH PowerShell Core in addition to using PowerShell Standard. Let's see, the Git integration, as long as you've got the Git client installed and you're in a folder, you have to be in a folder. Right now I'm in my examples folder here. We can go over to the Git icon and do a Git init directly from within here. Pick Workspace folder to initialize the Git repo in. I'll just do it here, right here in the examples folder. And then as you go through and make changes, just like you would expect, any changes are going to be picked up. And hello. Oh boy, picked up a lot.
23 of them, yeah.
We stage our changes, and it even drops down for a commit message, initial commit.
Or you can do it on the left there too.
Mm-hmm. I haven't done a git config to set my name or email ID on this machine yet, but yes, as Tom's rightly mentioning, the ellipsis menu, it's pretty darn robust. Adding remotes to your GitHub origin, whatever, pulls, all of that common stuff is here. I mentioned the Git Lens extension. If you do appreciable work in Git, Mike Robbins in particular is a big proponent of that particular extension. In terms of visualizing history, if you like to look at your document history visually as opposed to just what Git log can give you, for instance. This here, what I just clicked on, this PowerShell icon, I haven't seen the light with it yet, to be perfectly honest. Let me open up a new file. It's called the PowerShell Command Explorer, and it evidently comes with the PowerShell extension. And at first blush, it reminds me of the command palette in ISE, But when you click a commandlet, it doesn't do anything. And when you right-click it, you can get help. What's the point of that? It's going to open up your default browser and go to the help page. But if you keep your local help current, you know about get help. And then also there's insert command. But when you've got tab completion, I don't see the light with that either yet. So I removed it, and I learned something new the other day. You can easily remove these sidebar items if you found one that, for instance, you don't use or you don't want, just by right-clicking. It allows you to toggle to hide any of the default ones, or you could just select, I'll choose PowerShell Command Explorer to clean up the display on that a little bit. Once again, down in the lower left, it gives you some easy one-click access to the Settings GUI panel, as I said, the extensions flyout. Snippets is another subject, actually. That's something that ISE does pretty well. I have a link for you. If you know who Keith Hill is, I think he's a Microsoft employee. I'm not positive about that, but he published a snippets file. Jeff Hicks also published a PowerShell snippets file. Keith Hill. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. He's got an article and he links out to a gist. And all you have to do, a snippet if you don't know, is a keyword that you can type and then have VS Code expand it to give you the stub of maybe a code block, like an if statement or a switch statement or whatever the case may be. So Keith has a whole list of these things, and it's just as easy. I can look at the raw view, do a Control-A, and then back in VS Code, I'll just grab one of my instances here. We'll open the command palette and do snippets, and it says preferences, configure user snippets, and I'll type PowerShell. And each language that's supported in VS Code gets its own JSON file. It looks like mine's already pre-populated because I already pasted it in, but yours is going to be empty, and you just Control-V, and you can add and create snippets to your heart's content. When it's time to use a snippet, you could create a key binding, or you could open the command palette again and type snippet, and there's an insert snippet option. And then here's any user snippets that it gets auto-associated with your language, by the way. So I did snippet, insert snippet, and because the lower right says that my language mode is PowerShell, it gives you only the snippets that are in your PowerShell.json snippets file. Isn't that cool? So if you were doing a switch statement and you have a snippet handy, boom, there you go.
Okay,
So
we have a question from online.
Okay.
Is there an extension for the run script, run selection, stop buttons from ISE? I know F8 is the default for run selection, but he misses the buttons. You know of a...
Thank you for that. Yes. If you're looking for a run button, then I'd suggest that you look up the extension CodeRunner. The CodeRunner extension was not built just for PowerShell. It supports a whole bunch of languages, but it actually does give you run buttons like you have in the PowerShell ISE. Other than that, it's going to be keyboard. Well, one thing you could do, if you're showing the terminal, you can just run your script or .source, whatever you need to do in your terminal setting. But in your source code, let me clean up my view here because this looks crazy. In your source code, you could either place your cursor in the line, or I used to do that a long, long time ago, to run the selection, or you could run the script. But your question is, how the heck do you do that? Even in the menus, it's not particularly useful.
Unless you go to the debugger, then the run buttons are there.
Okay, in the debugger. But let me show you what I've done with key bindings, because what I do is that I have Alt-R mapped to run current command. Or you could map it to, I guess it's F8 in the ISE. What we'll do is we'll go to Settings, and we'll search Setting for Run. PowerShell run. Let's see if we can quickly find it. Oh, it's not a setting, it's a key binding. What am I saying? Sorry about that. So we're looking for keyboard shortcuts. So down in the settings or in the command palette, we can go to keyboard shortcuts, and I do have one eye on the time. So the keyboard shortcuts, again, has a graphical view, or you can go directly to the JSON here. And we would just search for run selection. And you see here that we're running out of time here, unfortunately, but these key bindings, you can actually scope them to the language mode. So in this case, let me zoom in a little bit. I've got an entry for run selection in the context of the PowerShell extension such that it's Alt-R. And if you want to change it from here, all you have to do is click the little pen icon and press the new binding, and it'll accept that. Press Escape to make it go away. And then the when condition over here, it's saying when the editor text focus and the editor language ID equals PowerShell. So when you create your own key bindings in JSON, you can actually scope a key binding so that it only is valid in a particular environment. You see what I mean? And notice, look like there's one here for run script, but that's in the context of NPM. And it doesn't have a binding. So there's the answer to your question. You want to look up the appropriate run commands like run select or run script. Looks like all of those are in the context of NPM. I'm not exactly sure why, to be perfectly honest with you. But I would say key bindings are your friend.
You can also, I've discovered if you right click in a PowerShell script, it'll give you that option too, if I remember correctly. Yeah, they're in there. Yeah, run selection, they're in there. If you highlight it, it'll, yeah.
Ah, there it is, run selection. Thanks, Tom.
Yep.
Very cool.
So before, I know we're getting really close to the end of the hour.
Yeah.
So any questions in here in the room that we need to field? Go ahead, man. Go ahead.
Do you have anything we can use for credentials? We like when we push up to Git, we're having issues with people committing their passwords up. Do you have anything where that'll like interface where we can do like a big credential in PowerShell or anything around that?
Are you looking for a way to securely store credentials, or are you looking for a detection engine that can detect the presence of credentials in source? Could you clarify a bit?
Just a way, like some way to mask it in the flat text.
Oh, okay. Okay. Nothing comes to my mind offhand in VS Code specifically. Let me do a search in the gallery here for credential. No.
There was some techniques that Tim presented to us. What was it back in September or October of last year you spoke to him? And you talked on that very topic, did you not?
Thank you. That's right. So I guess a more robust answer to your question, if you're looking for ways to securely do credentials with PowerShell scripts, do what Tom said. Look in the Arizona PowerShell users group archives, because that's true. I did a whole presentation on different ways to do that. Because, yeah, you never want credentials in plain text.
Do you remember when the last time was you spoke, Tim?
I don't remember offhand, but I can easily get that.
August, September, somewhere in there. I forget exactly when. I think you were here.
Let me.
No, it was in here. Yeah.
Post AZPosh credential session on Twitter. I'll do that as soon as we log off. And notice that I'm using Notepad. Is that ironic? Anyway, I want to thank you all so much. Tom, thanks for having me. I'll definitely follow up with what we've learned tonight. So check my Twitter feed. If you're not following me, do so. I post on Azure mostly, but PowerShell and Windows Server as well. Tech Trainer Tim is my Twitter handle. So, alrighty, let me stop the screen share if I can find.
What was the name of the chapter you had in the book? Because I've been passing around the copy I had.
Oh, yeah. My chapter is on Azure automation. So it's essentially how you can host your PowerShell scripts in Azure and run them on demand or on a schedule, all from directly in Azure. So I don't remember the exact title, but it had Azure automation in it. Okay, I think I successfully stopped sharing.
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Can you see my thumb?
Yeah.
Well, again, we really would like to thank you for presenting once again on a very good, informative topic. Hopefully everybody here got something out of it. I certainly did. And we really appreciate you taking the extra time out of your day, given that it's what, 9 o'clock there? Is it 9 o'clock there?
I'm in Central, so it's 8 o'clock.
Ah, okay. Well,
it's not too late to get some food, so that's what I'm going to do.
Okay, well,
thanks,
thank you very
everybody.
much, Tim.
You're welcome. Anytime. See ya.
Okay.